Welcome everybody. My name is Heiko Ulrichs. I'm a senior consultant with Microsoft Services, and now I'm presenting you Azure Stack Troubleshooting and Support. Let's have a quick look on our agenda. So first of all, we talk about the Azure Stack support model, the integrated support experience, lifecycle and support policy. I'll show you what might happen during a support case. We'll see a few details about the diagnostics flow, how to obtain Azure Stack logs using the privileged endpoint, and how to troubleshoot common issues. So let's start. Let's start with Azure Stack support. So a few Azure Stack support tenets, what we're optimizing for. So here are 4 principles or the overall goals behind Azure Stack. So first one is an Azure-consistent and integrated support experience for Azure Stack. The idea for the end user is really to have a consistent experience. Doesn't matter if they're working on Azure or on Azure Stack. And an integrated support experience for Azure Stack, which means and we'll see more details later, that it doesn't matter if you have a problem with a specific component under the covers or with a software part or a hardware part, you can use the same channel to raise support tickets and get support and the help you need. Seamless was focused on speed and quality of resolution. Again, it doesn't matter if it's a hardware problem or a software problem. You can use the same channels you already know to get support for your problem. And that's important for point number 3, to not confuse customers about who to call for support. So let me give you an example. When you have a disk outage and you raise a support ticket with Microsoft support will take care of handing over the support case to the OEM in the background. And that's also meant by bullet point number 4, Microsoft and Azure Stack OEM partners like Dell, Lenovo, OEMs can work together with minimal friction. So integrated support experience. We already mentioned it now a few times. For us, one of the overall goals is to have an Azure consistent support experience. And you can see it on the right side, on the top right side, how to raise a new support ticket. So you can just use the Azure Portal to raise a support ticket for your Azure Stack. The process behind raising support tickets is coordinated between the OEMs and Microsoft, so we can easily hand over support tickets without giving you the response that you have to call someone else. We will take care of handing over the support ticket. The support for the solution itself is provided by Microsoft, and the support for the hardware is provided by your OEM. Here are a few options we have today, how and where you'll get your support for your solution. So starting on the left side, pretty classic approach. We have an EA customer, an enterprise agreement customer, and they'll have 2 support contracts. One with a hardware partner and the second one with Microsoft. The hardware partner covers the hardware and their own software. For example, on the hardware lifecycle host you learned about in an earlier module. And the other part, the contract with Microsoft, is responsible for the Azure services and for the software part of the solution. The second model you'll see here in the middle is the CSP scenario, where the customer is a service provider and the service provider has only a contract with the hardware partner and does not have a support contract with Microsoft, because the CSP itself is providing level 1 and level 2 support for all Azure services to their customers. And the third scenario on the right side is when a customer gets support via a CSP, a customer that's consuming services from a CSP. And you see a model where the customer has a contract with the hardware partner. The hardware partner covers hardware and all the infrastructure operations. And the second contract is with a CSP. The CSP is taking care of layer 1, layer 2 support. And the backstop is level 3 support by Microsoft. So scenario-based support boundary, the hardware partner owns and should be called first in brackets for all hardware related problems. So I mentioned earlier that we have a seamless support process. So for you, it doesn't really matter if you call Microsoft or the hardware partner. It's not your job to figure out what the reason of your problem is. But at the end of the day, due to the fact that we'll do a handover in the background anyway, it might be a good idea for things that are obvious, like a defect drive, for example, to call and start the support case on the OEM side. Or, for example, for replacing a node. And the OEM will involve Microsoft if necessary. For everything else, either Microsoft, an enterprise agreement scenario, or the CSP should be called first for everything that's related to, for example, Azure services. And in case they need additional help, in case of the CSP, for example, the CSP can get level 3 support from Microsoft. So Azure Stack Support Policy, and that's something that you've already seen in our patch and update module. It's important for Azure Stack to remain in support to run within a supported window of versions. And as of today, the support window is 3 releases. Means let's assume that 1908 is the latest release. Then you have to stay on 1908 -2, which means that in this example 1906 is the last supported version. Everything that's older, so for example May 2019, which would be 1905, is already out of support. And another important thing that was already covered in our patch and update module is that our updates are non-cumulative updates, which means you cannot skip updates. In case you are still on 1905 today, then you have to install 1906, 1907 first before you can install 1908. So you should make sure that you are always within the supported window of releases. So let's dig a bit deeper into how to submit a support request. And again, enterprise customers can go to the Azure Portal. They can go to portal.azure.com, click on Help and Support, and raise a support ticket for their Azure Stack problem. But they can, of course, also use the known channels through their Premier support or solution mission critical support. For CSPs and their customers, it's slightly different. So for a CSP, the CSP has to go to partner.microsoft.com/support and needs to log on with their Microsoft Partner Network ID and password, and there they can open a support ticket. Here you can see a quick video on how to raise a support ticket through the Azure Portal. Yeah. As you can see here, it's a pretty simple process. Okay, so what might happen during support case? First of all, and this is not really Azure Stack specific, that's more or less the case for every single Microsoft and also non-Microsoft products. When you raise a support ticket, you should describe your issue. You should, if possible, describe what the impact of your current problem is. So, for example, a complete outage of your solution is probably more critical for your business than a specific problem with, for example, a panel within the admin portal that's not relevant for your daily operations. You should also be able to name the affected components, what exactly is affected by your problem, and if possible, you should provide logs. So in case you have a non-critical issue, you might be able to retrieve more detailed logs, and we'll see a few examples on one of the next slides, and already attach them to the support case to make sure that the engineer has already all relevant information to start working on your issue. Let's have a quick look on the diagnostics flow. So the diagnostics flow using the trace collector, it runs continuously in the background and collects events for Windows logs from all the components within Azure Stack. So from all domain controllers, Windows servers, failover clustering, Hyper-V, you name it, all the services that are running under the covers are continuously producing logs, and these logs are gathered by the trace collector. The file saving threshold is by default 200 megabytes, and the threshold is checked every 2 minutes. Here are a few more details. This is not really relevant for now, but in case you have very specific requirements, you can configure these things. So now that we know that the data is collected and gathered by the trace collector, how do I obtain these logs? And there are some details. So first of all, the coordinated support between Microsoft and an Azure Stack operator. So for some problems, there might be a reason to look into the Azure Stack Fabric, into the black box to break the glass and interact with components that are usually not visible and not available to the operator. Like, for example, I mentioned it before, Hyper-V or failover clustering. And why is this something that has to be done together with Microsoft support? Because you don't have access to these things. You cannot access the underlying VMs, the underlying components. But we have the so-called privileged endpoint. And the privileged endpoint is a service that is running on 3 of our physical nodes to make sure that even a single node outage does not affect the availability of our privileged endpoint. And the privileged endpoint can be accessed for emergency operations using PowerShell. So to access this privileged endpoint, you first of all need the IP addresses of your privileged endpoints. That's something that the OEM provides you with after the initial deployment. And you need a special account to connect to the privileged endpoint. And this account is also provided by the OEM at the end of the deployment process. And with this account, you can log on to the privileged endpoint. And we'll see a few screenshots on one of the next slides, the privileged endpoint is pretty limited. You can do some operational tasks like stop Azure Stack to shut down your Azure Stack completely. For example, for maintenance tasks, for moving a rack, for changing things in the power supply, to start Azure Stack after stopping it, to gather, for example, log files, to run tests, and also for some day one operations like configuring ADFS federation, Active Directory Federation services, and a few more things. These things can be done without the Microsoft support. And then there's the option to unlock the privileged endpoint to enable access to all the components that are running under the covers of Azure Stack. And this is something that can only be done as part of a support case together with a Microsoft. So here are two screenshots on how to collect log files. And on the first one here on the top is collecting logs using get Azure Stack log. And we can see it here, get Azure Stack log. This is used to retrieve log files, and you can see it here. We specified the output path and a few more things. For example, we can filter by a specific resource provider and all these things. We can specify a very specific time window here, for example, and then we can retrieve log files, and these log files will be written to an SMB share that's configured here. So that's one way to retrieve logs from a very specific resource provider and time frame, or all available logs within your solution. Since Azure Stack 1907, there's a second way to collect log files, and this is only available in a connected scenario. You can configure in the Azure Stack Administrator Portal the so-called log collection. And log collection will automatically collect logs for a specific time window. Here you can see collection time is last 7 days, and upload them to an Azure storage account. That makes it way easier to share log files with CSS, in case CSS is a customer services and support, the services organization within Microsoft, to share log files with them in case of a support case. And here, as promised, a screenshot from the privileged endpoint. So this is a privileged endpoint, and on the right side you can see we're here connected to AZS ERCS1. This is a privileged endpoint on an Azure Stack development kit, and we run without specific permissions get command, and you can see here we have a list of maybe 30 to 50 commands, and some of them should look familiar. I mentioned things like get Azure Stack log, or start Azure Stack, stop Azure Stack, and test Azure Stack. So these are things that can be done by the operator without involving Microsoft. So this is an entry point for all the things that cannot be done through the portal. And you need, as I said, on one hand, the IP address of one of the privileged endpoints, and on the other hand, the credentials that were provided by the OEM in the beginning. Important to know here, this is super limited. This is using just enough administration, and you are not allowed to use scripting. You're not allowed to use things like enter PowerShell or invoke command. So you cannot jump around and connect to other services within Azure Stack. What you can do is collect diagnostic logs, do post-integration things like the examples I mentioned, ADFS, DNS, certificate rotation, and you can also work with the support to unlock your system. So the process itself, what we can see here, accessing the endpoint, you need the IP address. The IP address is part of the JSON file that should be provided by the OEM, Azure Stack stamped deployment info. You can access it, and you can execute specific commands and then in the session. Get Azure Stack log is another command we already mentioned. Get Azure Stack log, you can see it here, is used to gather the log information from our trace collector. So the trace collector is continuously gathering logs and events from all the components within Azure Stack, and get Azure Stack log allows us to write these logs into a specific location we can specify as a parameter. You can see an example at the bottom. So enter pre-session is used to connect to our privileged endpoint. Here again, the example from our Azure Stack development kit. And then we use get Azure Stack log to write all logs to an SMB path of our choice. few more details around it. I'll not explain these things in detail. And here is another example of how to use it. So we need the IP address, we need our credentials, we need the password of our cloud admin. And then we create a new PowerShell session. We specify the time window we're interested in. So here in this case, from date is -8 hours and to date is -2 hours. So a very specific time window. And then we run invoke command in our session, and we write with get Azure Stack log data to our specified SMB path. And at the end, we close our session. Few more details. I already showed it. So we have from date and we have to date to get logs for specific time window. We have also timeout parameters to specify the timeout, the maximum allowed time that it is allowed to take to gather the logs. And we have also an output file. Okay, a few last notes. So system and event logs for all infrastructure VMs are collected in the virtual machine roles. This is one of the rules I mentioned. You can specify all the resource providers. System and event logs are part of bare metal. Failover cluster and Hyper-V is part of storage. And ACS, Azure-consistent storage logs are collected in storage and ACS. Okay. Here you can see a screenshot of how it looks like. So in this case, we specify the to date, and we can also filter by role. In our example here, you can see we filter by ACS, storage, bare metal, and virtual machine. When you do not specify anything, it will just gather everything that's available. Okay, another screenshot, how it looks. And here is an example of the expected output. So when you don't specify it, when you don't specify a specific resource provider, then this is how the output might look like. And what you can see here is all the services, all the resource providers. We see here ACS, Azure Consistent Storage. We see ADFS, but we also see things like CRP, which is our compute resource provider, and a lot more. And here's the table with a few examples. So I mentioned a few of them: compute resource provider, Azure Consistent Storage, network resource provider, storage resource provider, update resource provider. So everything is implemented in resource providers, and we can gather very specific log files. So in case there's a problem with networking, then it might happen that the support engineer asks you to gather only the network resource provider log files. Okay. Another troubleshooting assistance tool. So you don't have to connect to the emergency rescue console and download the logs. There's also on aka.ms ERCS, this link here, is a tool called ERCS Azure Stack Logs.ps1, which allows you to gather the log files remotely from a system that can access the emergency rescue console. Okay, now unlocking the system, the so-called break the glass scenario. Let's assume that there's a scenario that cannot be fixed from the outside, that cannot be fixed by using the portal. So there might be cases where we have to interact, where Microsoft support has to interact with the underlying failover cluster or Hyper-V or a SQL server. Then there's a way, together with the Microsoft support, to unlock the privileged endpoint. And unlocking it means that after successfully unlocking the privileged endpoint, we now have domain admin level rights. We have all permissions within the solution, and we now can interact and access services that are running inside the solution. So what's necessary to do that? So first of all, we need a support case. And within the support case, the support engineer might ask you to give them a support session token. And this is done on the privileged endpoint, accessing or executing get support session token. And this will give you a long token, a long string. And this token is then handed over to the Microsoft support, and they will then give you a challenge response you can use for unlock support session together with the unlock token, and this will unlock the privileged endpoint. Here are some screenshots we've taken on a live support case. So first of all, what you can see here is the IP address of our privileged endpoint, and then we run get support session token, and this is a part of your support session token. You'll send the support session token to the Microsoft support. They'll give you the response key, and then you use unlock support session as the second step. Insert the response token here, and this will unlock the endpoint. Here's the whole process. So on the service provider or customer side, we need a machine that can access the privileged endpoint. This privileged endpoint is only accessible via PowerShell. So we can connect via PowerShell to our privileged endpoint, and then together with the Microsoft support and the service provider personal or the customer administrator, we can unlock the privileged endpoint and then access infrastructure roles. Okay, last topic is troubleshooting common issues, just on a really high level. Azure Stack validation. So how can you figure out the status of your Azure Stack? And this is nowadays part of more or less every upgrade in Azure Stack, that we ask you to run test Azure Stack first to validate the status of your solution. And test Azure Stack, we'll see it on one of the next slides, will test a lot of real world scenarios to make sure that your Azure Stack is fully functional. So here's an example. We connect to our privileged endpoint using enter PS session before we run test Azure Stack. What does it do? I mentioned it, real world scenarios. So test Azure Stack is not just using ping to see if something is online. It creates resource groups, for example. It creates plans, offers, storage accounts, even virtual machines, and a few more operations to really make sure that your Azure Stack is fully functional. Few known issues. So in case the log collection takes a long time to run, you should check the progress in the PowerShell window to make sure that it's running and not locked by your cursor, by a mouse click, for example. And date time should be used. So the filter I showed before should be used to filter the amount of data that is collected. In case you're missing specific logs for a specific resource provider and get Azure Stack log did not collect logs for some roles, this usually happens when no logs are found for the specified date range, or the PowerShell window disappeared while the tool was running. That might happen when you run out of disk space. You can check this in get Azure Stack log output.log. Should show you the reason. And a few other common issues are, for example, resource providers that are not registered. So when connecting to a tenant subscription with PowerShell, you'll notice that your resource providers are not automatically registered. You can either deploy something through the portal, which should automatically register the resource provider, or another option is to get the Azure RM resource provider and then register them. And that's it for our support and troubleshooting module. Thank you very much.